Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I know that you're a very well-informed audience and also that you're itching to get into the detail of what Brexit is going to mean for your sector and your companies. So look on me as the warm-up act before the main band takes the stage, because I'm going to talk a little bit about what's on the mind of the other 26 members of the EU, to give you the context in which the other member states are going to be approaching the Brexit negotiations. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual conduct of the negotiations themselves, and then I look forward to reacting with you at the panel discussion later on. I think it's a truism to say that the last year, but especially the last couple of months, have brought about a big change in mood and climate across the EU. And if you looked at the outcome of last week's meeting of Prime Ministers at the European Council, you can see that the mood is much more upbeat than it has been for a very long time. There's more positive news. The EU economy is growing again. Unemployment is coming down, even in the countries where it's still unacceptably high. The EU feels better about itself. And this is also partly a reaction to international events, to the election of President Trump, to the pressures coming from Russia, for example, but also in a way to the challenge of Brexit, because the EU is beginning to find its momentum again, and to feel that our particular model, our way of combining high standards of living but with a decent society, maybe its time has come again, and maybe the fact that one member state has decided to leave will make all of the others renew their commitment to the EU and increase the appreciation of what it actually does for all of us. I think this feeling of moving on also has something to do with a sense of exasperation with what's been happening in the UK. It took a year after the decision to actually get started in the negotiations. It took a long time for Article 50 to be triggered. And I think even now, it's still not very clear that the UK has reached the point of willingness to compromise, which is what you need in any negotiation. So that feeling of, well, we can't be hanging around waiting till the UK makes up its mind, we've got business to do, we're moving on, I think is now very palpable across the EU. And a lot of people ask me, will the EU 27 stay together? And there will be forces at work, including, I think, diplomatic efforts from the UK to divide the member states and to get different reactions from different partners. My prediction is that the EU 27 will stick together on the important things, on the big issues. I think that all member states understand this is a collective negotiation. To allow themselves to be picked off or divided on the key issues like the four freedoms or like the autonomy of EU decision-making, that would ultimately backfire on everybody. Now, of course, on the detail, there will be very different views and there will be lots of discussion and they will have to be reconciled. But I do think that there's quite a remarkable degree of unity and determination on the part of the 27, and I think that is going to make the negotiations go in a quite focused way. What I think is really happening on mainland Europe, if I can put it like that, is a starting up again of the EU integration process. This is partly political. There are always forces at work that subscribe to the bicycle theory that if you don't keep moving, you fall off. And I think that now that the economy and the politics are improving, there is this feeling again that we have unfinished business and we shouldn't move forward. It's also partly circumstance. I think that the EU was woefully unprepared for the migration crisis and woefully unprepared politically and institutionally. Justice and home affairs traditionally is an area of national sovereignty, but it's patently obvious, I think, to everybody that Europe cannot solve the migration crisis unless it acts together and unless it has at least a European take in terms of who do we allow into the Union, who do we not allow into the Union, how do we organise that. And there's very far from unity of purpose or harmony of view on that at the moment, but circumstance will drive us to find a European solution, even if nobody is actually asking for to be put in charge of what is certainly a poisoned chalice. So I think one of the points I want to make today is that the direction of travel towards a more integrated EU is certainly back on the agenda. That doesn't mean it will be quick, it doesn't mean there will be agreement on the detail, but the EU tends to move forward towards big projects over 20-25 years. The single market itself, the euro, enlargement, all of these things have been long and sustained projects with lots of zigzags along the way, but the direction of travel was clear, and I think that we're facing a new stage in that process. Because there are a lot of issues that the EU needs to face at the moment. I'm going to just talk very briefly about economic and monetary union, about defence, about migration, and about future financing, and then about trade as being some of the key issues that are on the minds of our partners, on the minds of EU leaders, and which will colour the way in which they look at the Brexit negotiations as well. So, on economic and monetary union, the euro has come through a major crisis. I think the markets again and again predicted that the euro would fail because they failed to understand that it's not only an economic project, it's a political project. And having had the doubtful privilege of being in the room when the prime ministers were wrestling with the euro crisis, what came through to me time and time again was that in the end, they all wanted the project to succeed, and they were prepared to take very difficult decisions that they would find hard to sell domestically because they wanted the euro to succeed. But it is unfinished business. It's not as stable a currency as it needs to be to have an indefinite long-term future. And so you will start to see a lot of discussion now coming out of Brussels and elsewhere about taking the euro deeper. That will, in due course, I think, lead us to have an EU finance minister rather than the current arrangement of finance ministers. It will be a development of what we have now, but there will be a specific euro finance minister. The holy grail for many people is to get to the stage where Europe can launch euro bonds. That's not for tomorrow, but it's clearly a direction in which the Union is going. And not the next time around, but at some stage in the future, there will be a budget for the euro area. Now, whether that is because all member states will at some stage belong to the euro, or whether it's a part of the integration of the euro, there will, I think, at some stage in the future be a euro area budget. So all of these things are going to push the EU in a more integrated direction because of the need to make sure that the euro is really a powerful international currency, and one that whose stability and existence is not seriously called into question. I know that defence is a very difficult issue to talk about in Ireland, but I think we will, as part of the EU, have to make up our minds the extent to which we want to participate in what's going to happen. It's very obvious that the United States is no longer going to pick up the bill for European security and defence, and why should they? We are a very rich part of the world. We should be able to pay for our own defence, but of course we've had it on the cheap over a long time, so we don't want to necessarily fork out the extra money. But I think the threats to European security, given that we are part of a very volatile region of the world, are very obvious. So we do need to take measures to be ready to defend ourselves. And I think that what is not felt here in Ireland is felt very keenly in the east of the European Union, the pressure from Russia, the threat of Russia. So there are a number of factors. On the one hand, the stepping back of the US, but on the other hand, the pressure from Russia is leading the EU to look more closely at defence issues. And again, the Prime Ministers last week did discuss defence in some detail. The Commission has published a paper which is very interesting to show just how scattered European defence resources are and how much money could be saved by having a more strategic and more European look at how we deal with defence. Trade, again, last week the Prime Ministers reiterated their clear support for an open, rules-based, multilateral trading arrangement with the WTO at its centre. That's very good music to Irish ears, I think. But we should also be aware that there are quite a lot of protectionist tendencies inside the EU. And it is, I think, something that Ireland is watching very carefully. The French insistence on screening inward investment in strategic sectors, which of course have not been defined. So I think while we continue to express our commitment to open and fair trading, we also have to constantly make sure inside the EU that our deeds follow our words. And so on the trade side, the wider trading side, I think we constantly have to guard against protectionist tendencies. All of this stronger integration drive, I think, is going to lead to a lot of debate again about Franco-German dominance of the EU. And I think those are the two countries that have always been the motor. And for different reasons, both are now finding that as being a part of their domestic policy. The election of President Macron is a very significant moment in where Europe goes next. He has declared his intention to champion reform of the EU, and I think that's very welcome because when the UK voted to leave, I was very saddened for lots of reasons, but one of them was that I felt we were losing the big member state which would champion ongoing reform of the EU, and an organisation as big as the EU needs to constantly reform itself, adapt itself. And I was worried that there wouldn't be anybody to take up that mantle that the UK has worn in recent years. Now, of course, you have to be careful what you wish for. So a French view of how the EU should reform may not in every sense coincide with the Irish view of where it's headed. But all of this is to point out that there needs to be, I think, a much more open debate in Ireland about what kind of EU do we want to see for the future. And I think then a lot more work by government, of course, in thinking about the future of Europe, but also by companies and in particular, I would say, by trade and representative organisations in thinking and coming forward with ideas about how do we want to shape the EU. And I'm interested to see that there are discussions around about whether Ireland should join one of the geographic groupings that exist in the EU. The Benelux is going through a bit of a revival at the moment. You have the Visegrad representing the East European countries. We don't fit clearly into any geographic group, but I think we could be a very welcome kind of floating member of a number of different groups. And I think now that the UK will not be there to put up the stop sign to certain facets of integration that we mightn't necessarily be enthusiastic about, Ireland Incorporated, which means all of you as well as the government side, will have to invest a lot more in building alliances with other countries, bringing pre-concerted positions to the table. So, because I think up to now we've had a situation where it was possible to have a two-speed Europe, and if you didn't want to go ahead with the countries that wanted to do more, you could stay comfortably in a sort of outer circle because there was a big member state, the UK, in that outer circle. But I think the consequences of choosing to remain outside some policies in the future will be different. If it's only one or two or three small member states, it's obvious then that the EU will move ahead and that those smaller member states will not have the capacity to influence the direction of travel. So I think we will miss the UK for all kinds of reasons, but including for that reason. And the only possible response is to step up the effort that we invest in our contribution and our alliance building to shaping the future of the European Union. So all of that probably sounds very abstract and very far away from your immediate concerns. But I think it is important to have in mind that while Brexit is the, I would say, overwhelming and almost the only issue debated in Ireland, and as Michael said, having been to 4 conferences in fewer days, that shows the intention that's rightly being paid to it. But it's important also to realise that for most of our EU partners, it's one of a number of issues on their particular agenda. But nonetheless, I want to say a little bit about the negotiations themselves. I think the European Commission is ready, it's well organised to be the negotiator on behalf of the Union. The Commission has decided to opt for maximum transparency, and so all of the negotiating papers will be published on the Commission website. And I think that's very important for all of you who want to follow step by step. So every paper that's sent to the Member States, 24 hours after it's sent to Member States, will be on the Commission website, and every paper that's exchanged with the UK will also be on the website. Now, they're dry and boring documents, but nonetheless, it's worth having somebody in your organisation who keeps an eye on the website and has a look at the ones that are more relevant to you. As I said, I think the question remains, when will the UK be ready to engage in the kind of very concrete nitty-gritty negotiation that is necessary? And I think at some point they are going to have to establish a hierarchy of wishes. The general and I think widely accepted view of the vote to leave the Union was first and foremost about getting back control over migration or immigration. Secondly, to take the European Court of Justice out of the UK decision-making frame. And then to leave the customs union because the UK wants to negotiate its own trade deals with other parts of the world. So I think at some point the UK is going to have to decide which of those is the most important, which of those is the least important. And out of that recognition of a sense of hierarchy between their objectives will come the answers to some of the questions that you certainly have and that we all have. So I think we are setting ourselves for a long haul. I think everybody has already internalised that. The negotiations have begun, but it will still take till the end of this year at least, I think, before they get into the discussion of the kind of trade issues that I guess you are most interested in. The European Council has decided on a certain sequencing. So they will start by discussing citizens' rights. And there, at least, both sides have now exchanged a first paper, and they make interesting reading. Both sides will have questions of the other, but I think it's possible to see where an agreement can be found. The second issue, I think, will be much more difficult. It is to settle the debts that the UK has incurred while being a member of the European Union. But it's obvious that the 27 want to make quite a lot of progress on that issue before they move on to the discussion of the topics that the UK wants to talk about. Because if they don't, there is a risk of the UK simply saying at the end of the negotiations, well, thanks very much, we're off now, and sorry that we're leaving you with the bill, but we don't accept any responsibility for it. So it's clear the European Council has said that when those two issues, plus the issue of Ireland, when there has been sufficient progress on those three issues, then they will authorise the Commission to move into negotiations on the scope and shape and detail of a future agreement. The time of actual negotiations is actually very short. There needs to be 3 months at the end of the negotiations for the European Parliament to give its consent. The Article 50 can be decided by qualified majority by the Member States, provided they have the consent of the European Parliament. So given that we are only starting now, and given that you need to allow 3 months at the end for the European Parliament to give its consent, we're talking about 12 to 15 months real negotiating time, which is not a lot considering the degree of integration that has been achieved over 40 years of UK membership of the EU. So we will have to be very quick and efficient, and the political level will have to be constantly involved in steering the negotiations and saying yes to this, no to that. Nothing will be agreed until everything is agreed, because agreements will be found across different sectors, and there will have to be give and take on both sides. So in some issues the EU will have to give a bit more, and others the UK will have to give a bit more. But the actual time for real negotiations is very short. Now, the Article 50, which is the one that conditions the divorce settlement, does wisely have in it a provision for extending the time limit, provided everybody agrees, and that includes the UK. And I think it will be a political judgment by the government in the UK whether they think politically they could accept or ask for more time or not. I don't make any prediction about that now, because that's something that will come up probably at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, but the provision is there. I think when we get into the details of the Article 50 negotiations, we will begin to get big signposts as to what the future trading system will look like. And one of those keys is the UK really going to leave the customs union? They have said very clearly they will leave the single market. That's because they don't want to accept the free movement that goes with it, free movement of people that goes with it. They are also saying very clearly that they are going to leave the customs union. But I would certainly hope that as we get into the detail of the negotiation, and as British business also begins to see the complexity that they will face in doing business with the rest of the EU, that perhaps there would be a chance to revisit the decision to leave the customs union. If they were to decide that their better interest would be served by staying in the customs union, then I think it would simplify a lot of questions for Irish business, because it would mean today's arrangements could continue. If they do decide to leave the customs union, then obviously the negotiation of transitional arrangements from where we are today to where we would be in 5, 6, 7 years' time with a newly negotiated free trade agreement, then that would assume all of the importance in the world. And I would imagine that on both sides there would be a desire to have reasonably long transition periods so that you could manage a change in the way we do business rather than to have more immediate disruptions. But again, it comes back to politics. And I think that it's clear that the hardline Brexiteers want the quickest possible exit and the shortest possible or even no transitional arrangements. I think that practicalities will prevail when we get into the detail, and that we will be looking at reasonably long transition periods, which may not be the same in every sector. They could be differentiated from, say, industrial goods to agricultural products or whatever, but I think they will be needed to make sure that trade continues to function smoothly in the future. I think that it's obvious that events like today and the work that you are doing with Bord Bia is very necessary. It's also it's necessary for your companies, but it's also a very necessary input for government, because while governments across Europe, and I think Ireland is certainly ahead of the curve in this, are doing a lot of analysis, they need the real practical knowledge on the ground of how will your businesses be affected. And then that needs to be sort of bulked up to a level that government can actually negotiate with. But I really think things like the Barometer, things like company experience, you looking ahead and anticipating what the difficulties will be, that's very vital and very useful, not only to the Irish government, but also to the European Commission, which is a relatively small organisation, has to cover 28 countries at the moment. And so when well-documented cases can be brought to the Commission, my experience is that they get a good hearing. But going in and just saying, oh, you know, it's all very difficult and we don't exactly know what's going to happen, but, you know, please help us. They can't do anything with that, even with the best will in the world. So the better you can formulate the case, explain what the problems are, show, even try to come with solutions, and which may involve looking again at some EU rules or whatever, but bring hard fact into the negotiating team as early as possible. That's what I think will help build the kind of solutions that will work best in the end. I do hope that British industry will be more vocal in the coming months than it seems to be at the moment. And that when they begin to look at their trading practices, their supply chains, the impact on them, that they will also take the same kind of well-reasoned case to their government and say, look, we want the least disruption possible, and so we're going to have to look at things that may have been politically taboo, but now it's in our best interest to look at practical solutions. I think also, and this work is already underway, we need to talk to other member states who have similar interests, and we have lots of points in common with different member states, so we need to be talking to them one time on agriculture, one time on something else, but teaming up with them so that it's not just one lonely voice around the table in discussion with the Commission, that it might be 10 member states think this, or 5 think that, or 15 think something else. So again, building alliances based on a good factual case, I think is really very important. And I think last but not least, Ireland also needs to be looking ahead and at least thinking about if the UK does leave the customs union and in many years hence does conclude new trade agreements with countries around the world, then what implications might they have, in particular for the agri-food sector in Ireland. I'm going to conclude by giving my take on a question I often get asked, which is, well, do I think it will really happen? Will there be a change of heart? I'd love to see a change of heart, I have to say. I think it would be the best outcome for everybody. But as of today, I don't see that as being realistic. So my working assumption, like everybody else's, is that the UK will leave. The UK political scene is changing, and there's a lot of analysis at the moment about whether the election result means a soft or a hard Brexit is more likely. Your guess is as good as mine. But I don't see a change in British public opinion at the moment. And I think, of course, the politicians will respond to that. If there was to be a change of public opinion, then, of course, I think there would be changes, but I don't see that today. As I said, I hope that British business will be able to make a very strong and reasoned case to their government, which I think should influence the negotiations towards a more pragmatic outcome. But I think a lot of where the UK now is because of Tory party politics. And I think that will continue to condition all of the big questions and many of the small ones as well. So I think the most sensible thing that we can all do is hope for the best and plan for the worst. Thank you very much.